Hi everyone, welcome to The Secret Lives of NPCs. My name is Georgia Symons.
And I'm Jason Bakker.
And we are the narrative co-directors of Ghost Pattern, which is a studio that's based in Naarm or Melbourne in Australia.
Thank you. So to start, Wayward Strand was made on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and is set on Bunurong country, and we pay our respects to Wurundjeri and Bunurong elders, past and present. We also wanted to acknowledge that we're all meeting on the unceded lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone people, and to pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community. We encourage you to visit that link, ramaytush.org, where you can find out more about the community, as well as donate, and also to form relationships with First Nation groups in your own communities as part of your game development process.
All right. So our talk today focuses on our studio's debut title, Wayward Strand, which we'll tell you a bit more about in a minute. In particular, we'll be telling you about the process of developing our game's unique real-time narrative structure. In Wayward Strand, no matter where the player is, all NPCs are carrying out their own narratives in their own time. This abundance of characters and stories creates a rich world for the players to explore.
Yeah, like we hear over and over again from players that Wayward Strand feels transportative. It doesn't feel like you're playing through a narrative. It feels like you've been kind of dropped into an alternative world. And we think a big part of that is how we designed and developed our NPCs, their relationships, and each of their journeys through the game. And that's why we wanted to talk about our process.
We'll begin by giving you a bit more context about the game itself, as well as the team who made it. We'll talk about the values of our studio and how these shaped the game. We'll talk a bit about the consultation we did to flesh out our characters. Then we'll get into some technical and design details of the tools we used for plotting the simultaneous stories of the game. In talking through that process, we'll explore a few snags we came across in terms of finding narrative interest in the game. We'll then talk about how we brought the narrative to life through the realization and implementation of all aspects of the game. And because this is an industry event and some of you are probably on the company dime, we'll make sure we finish with some lessons that we learned along the way that we hope will be useful for you as well. So that's what to expect in what order, and it all looks very ordered and laid out, perhaps a little too much so. So we wanted to show you this. Some of you may recognize this. It's a page from the book We're Going on a Bear Hunt by Michael Rosen. Now, bears are living creatures and they should never be hunted, so just ignore the right-hand side, focus on the left-hand side. It says, we can't go over it, we can't go under it. Oh no, we have to go through it. If it seems like we know anything about developing a real-time narrative game now, just rest assured that we didn't used to. We used to know nothing. This was a really challenging game to make. You know, we couldn't go over it. There were no other games that were like it enough that we could just reskin. We couldn't go under it. It's just not the kind of game that you can shortcut in any way. We had to go through it to make this game. We had to look way outside of games for inspiration. We had to look to music and literature and who we were as people and our nation's history. And we had to write our dialogue like it was an immersive theater show and then record it like it was a film. And this meant that all the processes we'll talk about today were sort of MacGyvered together with string and tape and optimism. But the only way that we were able to do this was by going through it. And we encourage you to do the same. If you've got a narrative game idea and you're at the start of your dev journey, don't wait until you know how to do it. Just go through it. Okay, here is the trailer for the game in question.
So you're excited after all?
As if.
Oh, well, my mistake. Now, your job is to go to each of the patients' rooms and spend some time with them. Got that?
Yep.
The name's Esther. What's yours?
Casey.
Casey. Very original. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got to go solve a mystery about a goat.
Is this you?
Oh, yes, that's me. And the family.
Would you like some company?
Of course. Be warned, I am writing up a storm at the moment.
You were in the war?
We escaped. And myself.
I'm doing work experience.
Steadily? Well, working up here is an experience, all right?
Now, as you know, my room happens to be beside the nurse's station.
You were listening in on them. Got the picture.
We are to have a visitor.
Something's fishy, if you ask me.
I exhort you all to follow her every command as we prepare for tomorrow.
You both know the drill here. Regardless of what's going on...
Patience first.
Dr. Bashard?
What are you here for? Time to turn me sunny side up?
You think I'm trying to kill you?
You've been picking foxglove and slipping it down the dumbwaiter. Death by 1,000 slurps.
Director,
Mr. Pettigrew,
I have seen that you talk.
I will speak with him about your case.
Thank you. How are you finding your time on the ship?
I hear people talk about things, but I'm not sure what they're on about.
That sounds a bit like the life of an older person. Nobody explains to us what's going on. We just have to piece it together as best we can.
All right. Wow, you all are so nice. Thank you. So Wayward Strand is, as I said, our debut title. It's a narrative game set in regional Australia in 1978. And you play, as you saw, as Casey, who's a 14-year-old girl whose mother is the head nurse of a hospital, which just happens to be on an airship that's suspended in the clouds above your small regional town. It's the summer holidays and your mum can't find anyone to look after you for a couple of days, so you go with her up to the hospital and she gives you the job of spending time with the patients in the aged care ward, keeping them company and helping them out with anything that they need. So that's the setup for our real-time narrative game. 3 days as a teenager, talking to the residents of this floating hospital, getting to know them, getting a brief glimpse into their lives. The game's about a 4-hour round trip and is fully voiced by a cast of 15 superb actors. Many people contributed to the making of this game, and we always like to highlight this. We find that the best ideas are found in the space between us. And as you'll hear throughout the talk, Jason and I are definitely not the authors of this game, especially not when it comes to the details of the stories. We're just the people who happen to write it down. Of the 33 fine people you saw on the slide before, the ones on screen now formed the core team. So these are the people who were along for long sections of the development journey or who directed significant parts of its development. As you may have noticed on the other slide, our team does come from outside of games. That's both in terms of who we are as non-binary people, women, people of color, neurodiverse people, new parents, people from working class backgrounds, and it's also in terms of our professional backgrounds. Some of us have come to video games from theatre or music or comics or VTubing. And what this means is that although we all love to play video games, we know that video games are not made by us, about us, or for us all that often. When people like us appear in games, it's often as NPCs, with a few repeating lines of dialogue, a quest to give, and maybe a crush on the player character. And this has a deep and conscious impact on the kinds of games that we feel compelled to make. Wayward Strand is a game that strips back player agency and gives space and power to the NPCs. The gameplay is geared towards listening and caring for them rather than enacting your own desires upon them. And this is deeply informed by who we are as a team and our lived experience. So that's the team, and this is us, the narrative team. So my focus was squarely on narrative, including voiceover, direction, and casting. And Jason does everything.
Except art.
So Jason comes from a lot of programming experience, but before this game had only ever really dabbled in writing. I come from a lot of writing experience, particularly in the theatre, but had not even really dabbled in video games. I mean, I played Portal 2 on my MacBook with my trackpad, but nothing that could be considered, actually making a digital game. Jason and I found very quickly, though, that we were a really good team. The disparity of our professional backgrounds meant that we brought different strengths to the team, but we're also really deeply curious about each other's work, so we were able and open to learn from each other throughout the process. It's also worth saying that Russell, who was on that slide, who mainly worked on programming throughout the game, was deeply involved in the ideation of the game, so a lot of the character ideas and broad brushstrokes plots come from him as well as from Jason.
Oh, yeah. So our initial inspirations for Wayward Strand came from like our personal relationships with older people in our lives, stories that they've told, or experiences that we shared with them. And we thought that older people's lives were really interesting to explore and have players think about, and to have represented within media, like outside of the cookie cutter way that a lot of old people are represented as like mentors or sources of knowledge, or people that give you a sword or whatever. Instead, we wanted to present them with full lives in the present moment. So Wayward Strand takes place across 3 in-game days, and all characters more or less live out those 3 days within view of the player. This allowed us to tell stories where the rhythms of daily life are a critical element of the stories. Unlike other media, where a character has to have like a cinematic moment of realization or a moment of conflict that drives the story forward, we could represent how stories and events take place more in real life. So, messily and fits and starts, woven amongst like other things that are happening in your life, with important things sometimes taking place outside of the exciting cinematic moments. Like a kind of funny example of this is for a long time, we were aiming to get like toilets into the game and have each of the characters' schedules, like bathroom schedule, interact with each of their stories. So maybe a character misses hearing a critical thing because they went to the toilet, or maybe somebody excuses yourself when you're spending time with them just because nature called. But they could do that without any big narrative consequence sometimes. It's a way to bring in the feel of like reality that's quite unique to this real-time storytelling format. Because if somebody's on the toilet in a movie, that's because maybe it's a comedy, or maybe they're about to be strangled by James Bond. Shout out to objectively the best Bond movie, GoldenEye. But yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. But you're not going to have a heartfelt moment with a character happen just after they've gone to the bathroom in a movie for no reason. But we do have those heartfelt post-bathroom moments in real life. And that just never gets reflected in media because you have this limited linear plane on which to work, and the juxtaposition just has a different meaning when it's been placed there for you by a director or a creator in a deliberate way, as opposed to in this kind of dynamic way that we have, where if that happened, it would just happen within the game. It's not necessarily part of our plan.
So I'll talk a little now about our process of consultation for fleshing out our characters. Our game has characters with a really broad range of lived experience. So we have many aged characters, of course, many of whom are experiencing chronic illness, as well as queer characters, a First Nations character, healthcare workers. And given that the point of our game, as we've been mentioning, was to show the richness of these characters' lives, it was important to us that we engage in consultation right from the start, and that we honoured these relationships through to the end of our development journey. One of the first teams that we started working with on consultation was the Bunurong Land Council, and I'm going to focus on this consultation as a bit of a case study for how we engaged in consultation. This was a really special relationship that we maintained throughout the entire life cycle of the development of the game. The Bunurong Land Council, just for some context, is the traditional owner group representing the First Peoples of the area of regional Victoria where Wayward Strand is set. As soon as we agreed to make this game together, we got in touch with the Bunurong Land Council and we went and had a first meeting with them. We opened up questions about locations where the game could be set, any landmarks with cultural significance that we should be aware of, as well as what kinds of Aboriginal characters we might be able to represent in the game. And it was these early conversations that fueled the development of the character of Ted, who you can see on screen, who is the much beloved teen cable car operator with a secret ambition to write comic books. From there, we ended up consulting with a number of people from the Land Council in an ongoing way, including Bunurong elders. And the bullet points that you see on screen are just some of the principles of how we engage in that consultation. So the fact that we engaged from the start ensured that we never included anything in the game without first knowing that it would be appropriate to do so. This ongoing engagement also meant that our collaborators at the Land Council weren't just correcting our ideas, but also conceiving of their own ideas and contributing to the creative development of the game. And they had real agency in terms of determining how their culture would be displayed on screen and communicated to an audience. There also never came a point where we ended that relationship or sort of said that we'd kind of done enough consultation. All the way through to voiceover casting and direction, we had input from the Land Council about what that character should sound like, and we ended up being fortunate enough to cast Shane Clayton, who's the son of a really well-respected Bunurong elder, and Shane himself was also able to bring that fantastic cultural knowledge into the room. And the last point on the slide says listening before agenda. It'd be great to be able to say listening without agenda, but in doing consultation, it's great to sort of be honest with your scope, and there would be no point us pretending that we weren't trying to develop a video game. But whatever vision that we had for how it would turn out, that was always secondary to our listening and our relationship and to hearing what the Bunurong Land Council and their various elders and representatives were saying to us and honouring that before honouring what we thought it should be like.
Yeah. The fact that we could be so responsive to the consultation over the course of development does feel like an advantage of this unique storytelling structure, which we'll get into the structure a bit more soon. We weren't relying on certain interactions between characters as pillars of a single linear storyline, and that meant that, if we were making changes to particular bits of the game, we could do them without, kind of taking some critical bit of the arc of the game and then like knocking out that pillar or whatever. We still had to consider knock-on effects of every change, because every change would have this ripple out to all of the other like storylines and characters and so forth. But yeah, nothing was like load-bearing in that way. Yeah.
So these are some of the other people that we consulted with throughout the game. Dementia Australia, the CEO, Kate Swaffer, lives with dementia herself, and she was a fantastic consultant on the game. We also have Goldie, our art director's mum, happened to be a nurse in the hospital in hospitals in the 70s, so she was a really great source of knowledge in terms of what that experience was like. And we have a lot of team members as well who had lived experience that fed into the game, whether that was about being raised by a single mum or about their lived experience of gender or racialized identity or class or chronic illness. And of course, our wonderful actors also brought so much authenticity to their characters, and we were able to keep making some critical script changes through the recording process. A bit of a funny story about this is, I don't know if we have any German speakers in the room, but we have our character, Mr. Pruss, who you would have seen in the slides. And at some point, really early on in the development, that his story is that he had this wife who he was so devoted to, and she's sadly passed away now, but he remembers her a lot. And her name used to be Alte. And then I can see we've got a German speaker over here giving me the look I was expecting. We got into recording with our actor who we were recording remotely from Austria. And he came to that part in the script and he said, Alte, this is, why is he saying this about his beloved wife? And we were like, oh, that's her name. And he was like, no. So you might be able to verify for me. Our actor told us that the meaning of this word, which we thought was just a name, is it's kind of like calling your wife the old ball and chain, or the old bag or something. It's a really disrespectful thing to say about your wife. So luckily we picked that up with him in the recording studio, and we were able to change her name to Anna, which is a much more, standard Austrian or German name. And our actors that was probably the most egregious mistake that we had, but our actors brought a lot of other kind of cultural knowledge or knowledge from their own lived experience to those characters. So in terms of the simultaneous stories that we told throughout the game, in many other games, your NPCs might have a few looped animations to make them look like they're doing stuff, but they are ultimately kind of existing to wait for you. So we asked ourselves the question, what would the player experience be like in a game where no one waits for you? You have to keep up with them and listen to them and play in service of them. And this idea was largely inspired by immersive theatre. And my background, as I mentioned, is in theatre, which is why I was asked to join the team to bring that knowledge to bear on the game. So we needed to create stories, enough of them with enough detail, that would populate a fully realised world characterised by overlapping dialogue and confluences of action. And this is the question that we started with and that we still often get asked about the game. How do we guarantee a satisfying narrative journey if we can't guarantee the narrative itself? The first thing to say about this question is that satisfaction is a rather limiting goal in terms of what we want our player to experience. Our game's about a teenage girl. She's on her summer holidays and her mum has dragged her along to spend time in an aged care ward with a bunch of old people. So satisfaction is not necessarily what she would be experiencing. And so as nerve-wracking as it was, we wanted to create an experience that left room for boredom or frustration or maybe even anger. And this was reflected back to us in a lot of the reviews we got. Many reviews contained a similar version of this sentiment, but Emily Spindler from Games Hub captured it in a really great way, which we were really thrilled to see when she said this: "There were some small moments where I was unsure of what to do. And while this did leave me wandering the halls aimlessly for a brief time, it ultimately felt like this added to the overall feeling that you really are Casey, wanting to help, but unsure how." And that's the exact feeling that we were trying to create. Is like, we don't necessarily need for this to be this action-packed, rising action kind of experience. We wanted the player to have moments of really deep, heartfelt connection, but then also moments of boredom or moments of not knowing what to do or moments of trying to figure out how to be helpful. I also want to talk about the narrative shape of the game. So this is a page from Matthew Frederick's surprisingly insightful coffee table book, 101 Things I Learned in Architecture School. And this page that you see here reflects how in architecture, the organizing principle for a building can be expressed in a simple geometric diagram. In many creative writing courses, some of which some of you may have attended, it's taught that there is exactly one story shape. This tedious, ugly, boring, vaguely phallic, time-tested and data-backed hump, Freytag's pyramid. The action rises, there's exactly one climax, sound familiar, and then everything is wrapped up in a neat little bow. I hope that in the year of our Lord 2023, it's uncontroversial to say that this is like kind of played out and tired, and it works in the same way that a Honda works, i.e. just fine. Do we want to make things that are just fine? What about this? See, now it's a star, and that's more fun. Let's make something fun. I really think that Wayward Strand's organizing principle, if it was anything, would be this hairstyle. So Wayward Strand takes place over 3 days, and at the start and end of each day, you have a conversation with your mum, Ruth, who's the head nurse. So the shape of Wayward Strand is all of these strands that are running parallel, and just like a little louse, you can jump from strand to strand, but then there are these gather points, and we use these conversations with Ruth to gather the strands together and make sense of those strands for the player. Ultimately, though, there are infinite shapes that your story in your game can and should take, and it's so fun and freeing and a bit freaky to consider all the myriad ways you can break away from silly little 19th century pyramids like this loser who try to convince you that they've been around since the time of the pharaohs. Anyway, rant over. We're now going to take you on a deep dive of our process of structuring and plotting the game and bringing all those values and theories and principles that we've been speaking about so far to life. So if you unbraid that ponytail from before and stick all the strands of hair up on your wall, I'm starting to regret this metaphor, it looks like this. This is the wall of our Melbourne studio circa 2018. And then if you put all of that under the microscope, it looks like this. Our plotting document is a little too big to fit on one slide. This is about 70% of it. Linear time runs from left to right, and then each row is one of our characters. And what you're looking at is all the different stuff that people are doing throughout the game. So if we zoom in further, say on this chunk, we can see the following. These are all the things that are happening on or around 10:54 a.m. of day one of the game. Even trying to get them all onto one slide like this, you still can't quite make out all the text because there's just so much going on. But if you really squint, you'll see that most of these events have a title like Esther Forgotten or The Inspection. And these are the names of the different stories that run throughout the game, and each story takes in a number of characters. So Esther Forgotten centers around Esther and an experience of chronic pain that she's having, but it also pulls in the nursing staff and the medical staff who are trying to treat Esther's worsening condition. Or The Inspection is about the staff preparing for a visit from a VIP who's meant to be arriving on day 3. You may also be able to make out in the tiny little text there that some of the scenes are called incidental. So as we plotted the game, we realized pretty quickly that we would need 2 distinct kinds of scenes, scheduled scenes and incidental scenes. So those scheduled scenes, they happen at the same time on the same day, regardless of where you are and what you're doing, even if you can't see them going on, they're happening in the background. And incidental scenes are those scenes where if you happen to come across someone in some downtime, you can sit with them and talk with them and interact with them in a less time-bound or plot-oriented way. So that was vital to situating the player within the world of the game. You know, if all you were going to do in this game was sit around, listen to conversations, and like sort of very occasionally interject, then it felt like there would be a distance between the player and their world, a distance that was a little greater than what we were trying to achieve. So we created these incidentals, these kind of hangout scenes, which mimic the fact that in real life, people have their own stuff that they're getting on with and that they need to do. But if you catch them in a moment of downtime, then you can kind of sit and hang out with them and have a moment.
Yeah. Creating Wayward Strand and plotting it out was a very experimental process for us because there aren't really very many narratives to draw from. Like, there are games like The Last Express, which is helpful, but feels more like the story ultimately revolves around the hero or what he can uncover. And then there's Sleep No More, like an interactive theater piece where you're wandering around a hotel and kind of a bunch of scenes are happening and you can wander into a scene as it's halfway through going on. But those stories are told in more of like a poetic and abstract way, where we were going for representing the mundanity of everyday life. For the characters, like in developing the characters, we had some initial storylines and characters, but we wanted to have them interact with each other regardless of if they had a storyline reason to. So one of the tools we built into our development process was what we called a character relationship matrix, which looked like this, where we put every character on like the column and on the row, and then in the cell for each kind of intersection of characters, that's how they respond to or feel about the other character. A lot of the process for defining the narrative of the game was like this, like trying to find ways of identifying what we were missing in our world, whether it was certain relationships that we hadn't thought about or considered yet, or interactions between characters that could happen but weren't yet plotted out, kind of like filling out all of the space where stuff could be but wasn't yet. Something handy that came out of mapping the characters' relationships like this is that we could define very specifically how each character feels about each other. Like in this example, Mr. Avery, Neil, is a writer of self-help books who, as we say in Australia, is a bit up himself, like thinks a lot of himself, while Ida, his neighbor, is a lot more reserved and polite. So from Ida's perspective, Neil is always interrupting her and bothering her, so she has a pretty negative feeling towards him. While from Neil's perspective, Ida's friendly and he's friendly, so they must be friends. And this relationship matrix, like, it was simple, but it was also actually a really good prompt to consider how to summarize how each character sees themselves, whether they've got a positive feeling towards themselves or a neutral or a negative feeling towards themselves. And all of this stuff is like very high level and lacks a lot of the nuance that's in the game itself. But it really helped, particularly during the co-writing process, like keeping us all on the same page. Yeah.
Uh-oh, a bump in the road. At one point, after we developed the initial character plots and timelines, we were trying to get publisher funding. And so we wrote up some plot summaries for each of our characters to try to get the publishers to understand what goes on in the game. And then we stood back and looked at our plot summaries and panicked. After reading over what we'd written, we had to ask ourselves, are our plots boring? Here's an example of a plot that we planned for the game, centering on one of the patients, Ida, who Jason was just talking about. So it says, Ida has been knitting Hugo a scarf for his birthday on Sunday, a surprise gift. Knitted into the pattern of the scarf is Hugo's family crest, which Ida sometimes sneaks into Hugo's room to get a better look at. When Hugo dies, Ida decides she must finish off the scarf in time for his birthday on the third day of the game. On day 2, Casey can figure this out and get the crest from Hugo's room and give it to Ida. Okay, like, it's maybe an interesting start for something, but is it a whole plot? But on reflection, we realized that our plots weren't very interesting when laid out in this way because they were never designed to be consumed in that way. They were never designed to be interesting when read from start to finish without interruption. So to go back to the ponytail for a second, Imagine that upon your head, you have just one hair growing out of the top of your head, and it's really long and it goes all the way down your back, but it's just the one hair. That would look very different than this ponytail. And our plots are the same. They're designed to allow the player to discover random bits and pieces and braid things together and gather more and more strands, both on each playthrough and in any given subsequent playthroughs. Writing out the plots in a linear fashion felt reductive and didn't help us understand how the plot and characters would feel to the player as the player was discovering random bits and pieces, possibly out of sequence, possibly on multiple playthroughs.
So we were feeling kind of, again, more confident, especially as we built out some like demos of the game and kind of were realizing that, when you're actually experiencing the game, these plots are working a lot better than they do in that way. And then another step that happened in development is that we went to a workshop in early 2019 that started us on this path towards an additional lens on the game's narrative structure. And it got us the idea to create what we called our dramatic narrative structures, which is up here. These worked similar to a schedule, like the schedules that we've been working with so far, but instead of the columns being hours of the day and the rows being like each character so that we could cross-reference what the characters are doing at whatever time, we had one of these diagrams for each character, and then we simplified the columns. So instead of them being like, 10 a.m., 11 a.m., it was just like morning, lunch, afternoon for each of the 3 days. And then, we had one for each character and a bunch of rows, which I'll go through. But this is us at work on those. And this, I guess, kind of shows how not only just coming up with all of the ideas, but building on them together was a very like team approach. So each of the rows that were on this sheet, this is an example for Esther, one of our non-player characters. So there would be, it's a bit hard to read, sorry, but there's Esther's story is the top row, so that's just this character's key scenes. Then there's Esther and Casey, so that's in those incidental scenes, what can be going on between Esther and Casey during this window of time. And then there's Esther's attitude, so how Esther's feeling during this period of time. One other thing that you can see up there is it wasn't just morning, lunch, afternoon for the columns. We also had an overnight column for the NPCs, where we described what happens overnight between the days of the game for that character. And that was, and then the player can discover that during the next day by like chatting with the NPC or overhearing things. And this is another just little thing that we did to make the world feel bigger than just what the player can see within the game. We had a different version of this dramatic narrative structure thing for Casey, the player character, because there's very little in the game that must happen for the player character. Like in most of the game, you're really free to just wander around, listen into whatever, talk to whoever. It was quite tricky, but we still found it quite handy to make one of these diagrams for the player character. The additional columns there are like what we called bookend scenes at the start and end of each day that were like required scenes, but then within the day, it's all up to the player. And Casey's rows were Casey's attitude, so how the Casey representing the player might be feeling during this time. Is she curious or comfortable or frustrated? What is Casey's plot at this time? Notes on any specific scenes that will always happen for Casey, whenever that would happen, but also generally what's happening between other characters and Casey during this window. Is she meeting a bunch of people for the first time in this, like on day one morning, or is she trying to help people not being able to on day two afternoon? And then there was like the player motivations and goals. And in this, we're trying to guess at what a player would generally be trying to do at that point in the game on their first playthrough. And this was important because we wanted to give the player complete freedom and a sense that they're creating their own goals, but we just wanted to make sure that generally whatever they would encounter would hopefully just feed towards whatever that goal might be at that time. It was a lot of kind of like guesswork and hope. Then there's the mechanics row. Are there limits on what the player can do in that time? Is the action on the ship moving towards a particular place as well? Like at lunchtime, everybody goes to the cafeteria for lunch. And are we going to try to build structural things into the script at this time? Like each character will recommend 2 other characters to talk to within the incidental scenes that you have with that character. And then one interesting thing is that we also had colors and lighting on this, which isn't really related to the player's story exactly, but we just wanted to make sure that they wouldn't clash. Like the weather on day 2 is like really stormy, but we make sure that there aren't scenes with the player that happen at that time that are really like happy or whatever. So with this dramatic narrative structure process, by zooming out a little and not worrying about the specifics of every single scene, this allowed us to define for each character a more meaningful arc or through line through the game as a team, as we gathered around these like physical butcher's papers or A2 prints. And this is an example of what Jordan was talking about earlier, like where, a bunch of the core team are working together on this, and that it not only allowed us all to collaborate and come up with ideas and solve problems, it also allowed us to like share amongst the team exactly what each character's storyline was, and the existing decisions and plans and thoughts. We were also able to identify empty windows of time during this process, or times where for a character they might have a bunch of functional scenes, but there's nothing that really changes their attitude much during that time. It just like really helped us expand out quite a lot, like what the player will come across within a particular playthrough. And also to take things that we had ideas about for a character and actually make sure that they're actually included within the game. So Ted, our young Bunurong man, is a good example of all 3 of these. He was a very well-defined character, but during this process, we realized that sometimes he didn't have much to do, like he didn't have a very active role in a lot of the existing storylines. And so we annotated on this quite a lot during this process on Ted's sheet. And this is a zoom in on that sheet, which is semi-legible. A theme that came out of our discussions with the Bunurong community was that members of the community are constantly doing things for each other, helping each other. So Maze Wallen, who's, our composer and audio director, had the idea that Ted is doing something for a member of his community. And then looking at the ideas here, I think we combined ideas 1 and 3 for what actually went into the game. One of Ted's aunties is pregnant, and so she's looking for work, and then Ted's helping her find some work. And then after confirming this approach with our Bunurong consultation collaborators, this turned into over a dozen additional scenes for Ted, both with Casey and with other characters. And we also managed to bring in a bunch of other characters into this storyline that were a bit bare during some of their time periods as well. Another example is Tomi, the nonverbal patient in the hospital. As we were trying to get into her mindset and understand her and her perspective, Kalonika Quigley, Wayward's animation director, brought up that it felt like we were relying too heavily on cliches about dementia from popular culture, as opposed to lived experience. And so that's where we organized the consultation with Kate Swaffer, who Georgia mentioned before. And with Kate, we just had this really lovely and kind of frank conversation about living with dementia. And from that, we were able to unpick some of the harmful stereotypes that we'd accidentally built into Tomi's character, as well as getting just a really good insight into what living with dementia is actually like, as opposed to what our assumptions were about it. Just one little example of this is that Tommy is mostly nonverbal, and Kate told us that actually that's quite rare for somebody with dementia, but often a person with dementia won't talk a lot, or people will think they're nonverbal because they're just fed up with communicating with people who don't take them seriously or don't know how to communicate with them. And then we were able to express this in the game. We were able to change it so that Tommy does eventually speak to another character who speaks to her in her first language. And then this is, it isn't the player character that figures this out and does it. It's a different character because we didn't want Tommy as a character to be a puzzle to be solved for the player, because that would then take away from the feeling that Tommy is an active agent in her own life. And it was obviously it made the game a lot better. It's all of this consultation, but it also was just a really enriching process. Having these conversations was just really incredible and really lovely, and the collaborators was super generous, and it just felt like it made us better people.
So after all that, we had to actually write it. This GIF is a tiny snapshot of our scene list document. So this is what you get when you plot 15 fully realized non-player characters across 3 real-time days. And whilst we'd written some test scenes before, it wasn't until we knew that we had the funding runway to complete the game that we actually tried to get the thing written from start to finish.
It was really difficult to actually write and finish off all of it, and I often remembered a tweet while we were doing it from Jake Elliott, one of the creators of Kentucky Route Zero, who advised to avoid creating homework for yourself during game development. And I was like, oh yeah, okay, we've accidentally created 1,000 scenes of complicated, interwoven, subtext-filled scenes of homework for ourselves. That was great.
Yeah, good job, us. When we went to record voiceover, we printed the script physically for the first time, and it was 1,500 pages. So that was a moment of panic. So actually writing the scenes meant that we were now testing out all of these grand narrative theories that we'd been talking about earlier. And sometimes our assumption about how a scene would work just didn't actually work when written out in full, or it wasn't feasible from an animation perspective. For me, as someone who's used to working with real flesh actors who are amazing, I had to really get out of the habit of saying, Ida finds a piece of paper and folds up a chatterbox, or Esther jumps on top of her dresser and hisses like a banshee. Sometimes getting a particular scene to work would require significant changes from our plan. For example, we used to have an intercom that was on the top level of the ship. There's a chef in the game who's kind of down in the bowels of the ship, and there are various places in the game where you can use the intercom to interact with him. We used to have one on the top level, but most of the other characters interact with him through this intercom that's in the mid-level of the ship, and we couldn't guarantee either from a narrative perspective or a technical perspective that every time you press that button on the top floor, he wouldn't already be interacting with someone in real time down below. So we had to create this whole thing that a sort of subplot where the intercom on the top level is broken, and then there's another scene where Devon kind of explains that to you after you've tried to use it. So things like that would crop up all the time. It was also during this scene writing process as well that we really ensured there was enough Casey-specific content within each character's windows of availability so that we could ensure the player never felt that a character had nothing to speak with them about unless that was our explicit intention. We do have characters in the game who actually don't want to interact with Casey or don't have anything to say with Casey, but we needed to make sure every instance of that was intentional and that Casey wouldn't ever rock up to a really friendly character's room and then kind of sit twiddling her thumbs. The dramatic narrative structure diagrams that Jason mentioned earlier were super useful throughout this time as well, because they could really determine the focus of each of those dynamic incidental scenes, because now each of those scenes could exist to highlight or underscore a character's attitude at that time, as well as relating to the scheduled scenes. So once we'd finally gotten into the writing of the scenes, we had to ensure that the two of us worked together to keep the characters' voices consistent, despite having 2 writers working on the scripts. And I think we did this in 3 key ways. It says they're major and minor stake in characters. So by this, I mean that there's no character in the game that was written 50% by me and 50% by Jason, because I think that would have probably led to a bit of an indecisive character voice. There's also no character in the game that was written 100% by me or 100% by Jason, because we felt like that would probably lead to, each character having quite a unique voice, but the tone across the game being inconsistent. So instead, and this is actually something that we've sort of realized after the fact, it wasn't really by design, but we sort of had each of us being kind of the majority stakeholder for some of the characters, minority stakeholder for other characters. So for example, I reckon I probably wrote most of Ida's scenes and most of Esther's scenes. I reckon Jason probably wrote most of Neil's scenes, most of Lily's scenes. And the effect that this had is that one of us was able to set the tone and the other one of us was able to read through what that person had done and kind of follow that tone. Second thing, and this is a bit more kind of stock standard writing advice, we used people that we knew and based the character voice on them. So Neil's voice is largely based on an old friend of Jason's. A lot of Esther's turns of phrase come from my family. I think we all, or I hope that it's not just me, that plays out hypothetical conversations in our heads with people that we know. And when you use those voices from your mind that come from a stock of real memories, it just adds a lot of depth and flavor to the game. And I think the final key to the consistency of our character voices is that we had 2 writers, but only 1 editor. So Jason and I both wrote on the game, and other team members wrote a few scenes here or there, but only Jason edited the scenes. And this meant that although we both had input throughout the process, there was just the one person going through and making sure that each character was consistent in their use of language and consistent in the way that they came across. For me, I knew we were onto a good thing in terms of the consistency of these characters when we were in the recording studio one day and one of our actors had a question and I was directing the performances. They said, why does my character say this? Or like, what am I feeling in this? I turned to Jason, who was in the room, and I was like, what was the thinking behind this line? And Jason said, you'll have to ask yourself. And I'd sort of lost track of the characters and they were sort of taking on their own life. So I had forgotten that I had actually written that scene. But we were still revising the script throughout the recording process, as we've mentioned a little bit, with the input from the actors. And the voiceover process was also such a time of discovery for us. The actors often showed us things about our characters that we didn't know yet. And putting our trust in our actors and forming a true collaboration with them really paid off in terms of the depth of feeling that our game was able to achieve.
Yeah. So after we completed the VO recording process, and that was a whole thing, and our audio team right up there right now doing a talk about the VO process, which I think shows our team's commitment to simultaneous storytelling. Anyway, after the VO, there was another stage of revision as we were implementing like the scenes into Unity with the animations. And at that point, like all of the VO is done, but we were able to still kind of like break a scene apart or like, just change the way that the player goes into it or all of that kind of stuff. Make only some of it available depending on if certain options are set, and that kind of thing. And a lot of this just came out of like playtesting the game and kind of feeling out like which scenes feel too long, which scenes would be better if Casey is like asking questions to go into sections of it as opposed to just being like a longer set section and that kind of thing. So after 7 years of development, we released Wayward Strand in September last year. How did it go? Well, it was definitely an experiment. We were trying out a new narrative form in order to tell a story that reflected the values we were trying to instill into the game. The values of subtlety, of complicated narratives that don't fit into stereotypical structures, and of representing characters that aren't often represented in games, especially as active agents in their own lives. And the feedback that we've heard in general has been great, very positive, but the specific things that we're hearing about the game tell us that we're going in the right direction, that this style of storytelling allows us to present characters in what feels like a brand new, like realer feeling way compared to other styles of storytelling, even within the medium of games. Yeah.
All right, time for some takeaways. Anyone want some Chinese? No, I don't know. That's terrible. There's some stuff that's not on this slide that I wanted to mention before I go through these points as well. Just shouting back to the earlier parts of the presentation, we really recommend that your studio find some way to form some relationship with the traditional owners wherever you are. That's more relevant in some parts of the world than in other parts of the world, but it's been incredibly meaningful for us. And we've engaged in that consultation ongoing. We've paid for that consultation, and it's been really, really a wonderful thing. So we definitely encourage you to do that. So we created a game in which stripping back player agency allowed for more dynamic, vibrant, and alive NPCs and a player experience that encouraged listening and reflection, which is what we were going for. We did it all by experiment. We couldn't go over it. We couldn't go under it. We had to go through it, and we strongly encourage you to do the same. We started with strong values, and we never compromised on those values. This motivated us to make the game, but those values are also structural to the game. They're the muscles that operate the machinery that we built. And we proved our hypothesis that just like those individual strands of hair that would be very strange if they were growing alone out the top of your head, like I was talking about before, our simultaneous stories created an experience that was much more than the sum of its parts. And speaking of the ponytail is a real narrative structure that everyone now knows about. Thank you so much for coming to our talk. Thank you. We're very proud of this game, and we're very humbled by the response it's had. We're here at GDC looking for long-term partnerships for our future projects. So if you know anyone who you think might share our vision for games, please put us in touch. We'd love to see you to have a chat after the session, get your feedback, answer any questions. And if you see us around, say hi. I do believe that we also have like approx 5 minutes left for some questions. So if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to step up to, is it these mics here, I believe? All right. I think you were first.
All right. So amazing talk, really inspiring, really appreciated it.
Thank you.
I did have a question. You mentioned how the simultaneous stories are more together than, the sum of their parts and all that. How do you in the game encourage the player to follow through these distractions so that they do not experience the stories as a single strand, taking away the value as a whole?
That's a great question. I think that my take on that would just be that it would be really hard to follow the one story the whole way through. And the reason that is that any given character that you are speaking to, especially earlier on in the game, there'll always come a time where they have stuff that they need to do. Like a nurse might come into the room and need to kind of assist them into their wheelchair so they can go to lunch, and they ask you to leave the room at that point. A character might get tired and ask you to leave so they can have a nap. They might even, if you're talking to them about a specific thing, like there's a thread through the game where Casey has an interest in the history of the airship, and you might be talking to someone and they'll say, oh, Mr. Proust knows about that. You should go talk to him. And so both explicitly with the characters telling you to go do other stuff, but also implicitly with them having to get on with their own lives, it kind of, each narrative shunts you out of it pretty quickly and into other ones. And it would be quite difficult to linger with the one character the whole time.
Perfect. Thank you.
No worries. Over here.
Hello. Great talk. Thank you. I had a question about how in your game does the time move on? And how did that imply the way you build the narrative and the way you kept the player to engage with the narrative and all of the edge case with a time-based narrative like you did?
Thank you. I've just remembered that our facilitator said that I should repeat the questions back before answering them for the purpose of recording. So the question was about how time moves on in the game and how we deal with edge cases around the functioning of time and how that time mechanic interacts with the narrative. I reckon this is a you question.
Yeah, so it was definitely super complicated. I guess we've got like, a timer that moves forward at like, I think 8 times speed. We changed it around a bunch. It was 16 times, 6 times, but we ended up on 8 times. And then all of the scenes that are meant to play will play out when they're meant to play. All of the incidental scenes have windows where they can play or not play. And then we eventually built in like a delaying system so that if a player is like halfway through a conversation with somebody, one of those incidentals, and another scene is meant to play at that time, it'll just delay so that the player can finish their conversation. We initially wanted to not do that, and then the player was always getting interrupted right when they were about to ask a question, and it was like really annoying. So yeah, it was very complicated is the short answer. Yeah, whatever here.
Thanks. My question piggybacks off the first one a little bit. Games that allow players to pursue depth or breadth on a time limit often have a problem where people who dabble a little and never go deep anywhere miss things. And I was curious to hear if you had sort of wrestled with that question and if you had landed on an answer for how to deal with people who got a little bit of a lot of experiences and never went super deep.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so the question was, like, how did we deal with the fact that often in these games, players might just dabble in various storylines and get distracted and never really get like a full complete storyline on a particular playthrough. One part of that I think was like Ruth and Casey, Casey's mom, the head nurse. They have like this relationship with each other that changes a lot over the course of the game, especially in those bookend scenes that are at the start and end of each day. So that has its own arc to it, and that comes to a resolution. And so you kind of, I think, even on a single playthrough, you get some kind of plot. But then we just embraced the chaos as well, and yeah, it seemed to work surprisingly.